What is going on, everybody? It is your boy, the Big Sig, back at it again with the Purloined Letter. Now, if you remember from the first one, you should recall that we are dealing with a scene in which a letter, by insistence by the minister, is taken while the queen sees this happening, and I believe even the minister himself sees her seeing him, but to avoid drawing attention due to this letter containing what would most likely be something that is incriminating on the behalf of the queen, a letter who I think is sent to her from the king. And so not only does the minister take the letter, but also replace it with a fraudulent one. And this is being recounted by one of the police officers with Dupin, the sort of detective protagonist of the Purloined Letter story, written by Edgar Allan Poe himself. And so they're under the assumption that, of course, the letter hasn't been exposed of, so it's possible that the minister himself still has it in his house, and so or on him, and so the police search everywhere and cannot find it, and little do they know, because according to Lacan, it's like their only job is to search the entire premises for what will be hidden, but they don't realize that the letter is hidden in plain sight. And then Dupin goes in and I think is talking with the minister, and then to distract him, a shot is fired outside, which makes him look outside the window, and he replaces it with a fake one, which he writes in his own handwriting. I think a verse from a certain Greek or Roman poem or poet or something like that. Anyhow, I think what is fascinating that we should keep in mind is that the letter represents the signifier, and this chain of events in which the letter is constantly swapping and being replaced with the fake one is like, in essence, this repetition of the signifier redoubling itself. And we should keep in mind that this is written around the time during early Lacan, Lacan of Seminar 2, who introduces the symbolic order and shows through his interest in cybernetics that the symbolic order in language operates like a cybernetic machine, in which, as long as you have a primitive foundation of zeros and ones in the cybernetic machine, then you get a constant sequence and movement, and there's a retroactivity that goes with it. And no matter what it is for, the numbers are arbitrary. All that matters is that there is a pretty much the sender and the receiver of such message, such flow. And so that's the main thing, and that the letter, the Purloined Letter, is always going to reach and arrive at its destination, just as this sequence of signifiers and the signifier, the letter, does so. We should probably see even the letter or this signifier in this sequence, in this repetition compulsion, as the drive, right? Maybe that which always returns to its place. So that's what we have to kind of speculate for now. But we have to recall in the beginning of the first video, in the first page, he talks about repetition compulsion, right? And we're dealing with insistence. Insistence is something that happens based upon a chance or an error within the symbolic order that causes this sequence to manifest. All right, so shall we? We left off at the end of page 12. All right, so Those who are here, are familiar with my remarks on the subject, specifically those illustrated by the counterexample of the supposed language of bees, in which a linguist can see nothing more than a signaling of the location of objects. In other words, an imaginary function that is simply more differentiated than the others. Let us emphasize here that such a form of communication is not absent in man. However, evanescent the natural pregivenness of objects may be for him due to the disintegration they undergo through his use of the symbols. Something equivalent may, in effect, be grasped in the communication or the communion established between two people in their hatred directed at a common object, with the proviso that this can never occur except in the case of one single object. One object defined by the characteristics of the being that each of the two refuses to accept. But such communication is not transmittable in symbolic form. It can only be sustained in relation to this object. This is why it can bring together an indefinite number of subjects in a common ideal. The communication of one subject with another within the group thus constituted will nonetheless remain irreducibly mediated by an ineffable relation. This excursion is not merely a reminder here of principles distantly addressed to those who tax me with neglecting nonverbal communication. In determining the scope of what discourse repeats, it prepares the question of what symptoms repeat. Thus, the indirect relating of the first scene clarifies the dimension of language, and the general narrator, by redoubling it, hypothetically adds nothing to it. But this is not at all true of his role in the second dialogue, for the latter is opposed to the first, like the poles in language that I have distinguished elsewhere, and that are opposed to each other like word to speech, which is to say that we shift here from the field of accuracy to the register of truth. Now, this register, I dare think I need to go back over this, is situated somewhere else altogether, at this very foundation of intersubjectivity. It is situated where the subject can grasp nothing but the very subjectivity that constitutes an other as an absolute. I shall confine my attention, in order to indicate its place here, to invoke the dialogue which seems to me to warrant its attributions as a Jewish joke, due to the nakedness with which the relation between the signifier and speech appears in the entity which brings it to the head. "Why are you lying to me?" one character exclaims exasperately. Yes. Why are you lying to me by saying you are going to Krakow in order to make me believe you are going to Lemberg, when in reality you are going to Krakow? A similar question might be raised in our minds by the torrent of aporias, eristic enigmas, paradoxes, and even quips presented to us as an introduction to Dupin's method, if the fact that they were confided to us by a would-be disciple did not add some virtue to them, owing to the act of delegation. Such is the unmistakable prestige of legacies. The witness's faithfulness is the wool pulled over the eyes of those who might criticize his testimony. What could be more convincing, moreover, than the gesture of turning one's cards face up on the table? It is so convincing that we are momentarily persuaded that the prestigigator has in fact demonstrated, as he promised he would, how his trick was performed. Where he was only performed in a new and a purer form, this moment makes us appreciate the supremacy of the signifier and the subject. This is how Dupin operates when he starts with the story of the child prodigy, who takes in all his classmates at the game of even or odds, with his trick of identifying with his opponent, concerning which I have shown that he cannot reach the first level of its mental elaboration, namely the notion of intersubjectivity, alternation, which without immediately being tripped up by the stop of its recurrence. So, let's stop right here and think about this. When we talk about this intersubjectivity, we are only focused on a two-body thing, right? But there's always going to be a sort of binding an element of a third that keeps us in this intersubjective, and even something that is neither purely subjective nor purely intersubjective, but transsubjective, and that is language. And it's something that takes life on its own. This is the machine. This is the letter, right? And it's the fact that in this duping, that none of them but Dupin could realize this. They are stuck in this sort of imaginary intersubjective relation and not realizing that where the letter is and how, and it's kind of funny that his name is Dupin. It's almost like he's duping. But the minister thinking that he's clever, but really, even though he's not, well, in a sense, he kind of is. He just kind of takes a chance. But at the same time, he's only clever in the fact that he could get away with it. But Dupin sees, the sequence going on. But the point being is that he recalls upon the game of odds and evens, which is, Lacan will talk about the coin toss. But if you've seen Squid Games, odds and evens has to deal with, how many marbles, pebbles am I holding in my hand? Odd or even. So do I have an even number or do I have an odd number, right? And this little kid tries to beat everybody by anticipating the facial, patterns and body language of the opponent, and then thus taking advantage of the game. Now the problem is that even though he is winning, what he fails to recognize are the pre-established rules that structure the two persons of the game, right? And he is duped. He realizes that there is a logic, but he misrecognizes it in the fact that he thinks that the logic and sole determination of him winning or losing lie within the other person, rather than seeing that there is an overall scansion or structure of the game that they still rely on a certain symbolic efficiency of two players performing the role, but insofar as they perform the role, the laws of this game, the structure of the game, the symbolic order takes a life on its own and becomes more alive. It's reproduced even more. But on the imaginary intersubjective plane, they misrecognize each other as containing the key to their victory or their possibility of losing. And so the point being is that this seems to be what's happening with the cop and all that. They're caught in this intersubjectivity of the thing, not realizing, I guess, the movement between the letter and its path. I could be wrong on this. This is what I'm trying to get. I know for the most part, if we take the letter to be the sign, right, then its movement is always going to be that which scansions the entire story, and yet everybody is misrecognizing it because they're so focused on the interrelation that they don't see the letter and the fact that it is, point blank in their face, especially for the cops. And so I wonder if, in the sense, Lacan brings up the whole point about gambling and the person having their cards face up, exposed. It's funny because, you're supposed to have a poker face. That way you can't tell who's got their cards, right? I totally am not good at poker, by the way. I've never played poker, nor do I really care about gambling. But, for any gamblers out there, anybody who's played, you could correct me on my terminology. But for the most part, whatever, cards are supposed to be in your hand, you have to make sure that you have a poker face so you don't get called out, right? And so say the reveal deck. But it's like if Dupin didn't have that and he just has his thing right there, it's like, will they even notice because they're so worried about his face? Because it's their facial recognition or body gestures and all that are supposed to indicate, what each player's hands may have, like, as far as like what cards they have in their hand. And so it's like the same logic is persisting in all these different analogies of different games. And it's the same thing of odds and evens. And Lacan brings up the whole thing about the odds and evens machine that plays the game and mimics the logic. And so you could play with the machine, and the machine is going to go off with a different series of insistences and movements and orders, and it's bound to fail. But it shows that it's only within the possibility and its insistence that a different order could come out. You could get evens so many amount of times until odds come out. It's not by any randomness or determination, like a telos, right? But by an insistence and condition, only insofar as it is contained within the sets of possibilities. And this is what happens in the level of language and the signifier within language. The signifier which is in relation to the subject, and the subject accounting for itself, that comes about within this condition of movement. And we're also talking about compulsion repetition, right? So it is drive. We're talking about drive. But we got to think of drive being related to the repetition and breaking down the symbolic order. We haven't really talked about the real and drive, and that's later Lacan. But for now, to remind ourselves, we're talking about this insistence that goes beyond intersubjectivity, and something that Derek Hook likes to use. He calls it transsubjective. Right? It goes beyond the subjective and intersubjective. All right. So this is how Dupin operates when he starts with the story of the child prodigy. Oh, I read that. All right. So this does not stop us from being treated in order to dazzle us to the names of La Rochefoucauld, La Bruyere, and Machiavelli, and Campanella, whose reputations now seem trivial compared to the child's prowess. And then to Chamfort, whose maxim that the odds are that every idea embraced by the public, every accepted convention is foolish since it suits the greatest number, will indubitably satisfy all those who think they escape its law. This is precisely the greatest number. The fact that Dupin taxes the French with dishonesty when they apply the word analysis to algebra has little chance of threatening our pride when, moreover, the freeing of that term for the other ends implies nothing that should stop a psychoanalyst from considering himself in a position to assert his rights to it. And off he goes, making philological remarks when should positively delight lovers of Latin. When he recalls without deigning to say any more about it than ambitus does not imply ambition, religion, hominus honesty, a set of honorable men who among you would not take pleasure in remembering. What these words mean to assiduous readers of Cicero or Lucretius, no doubt Poe was having a good time. But a suspicion dawns on us. Isn't this display of erudition designed to make us hear the magic words of our drama? Isn't this prestidigitator repeating his trick before our eyes without deluding us into thinking that he is divulging his secret to us this time by taking his gamble even further, by really shedding light on it for us without us seeing a thing? That would be the height of the illusionist's art, to have one of his fictional beings truly fool us. And isn't it such effects which justify our harmless way of referring to many imaginary heroes as real personages? Thus, when we are open to hearing the way in which Martin Heidegger uncovers for us in the word aletheis the play of truth, we merely rediscover the secret to which truth has always initiated her lovers, and through which they have learned that it is hiding that she offers herself to them most truly. Thus, even if Dupont's comments did not defy us so blatantly to lend credence to them, we would still have to make this attempt against the opposite temptation. So let us thus detect his track, where it throws us off track. And first of all, in this criticism by which he explains the perfect lack of success, we already saw on the surface in those few furtive gibes the perfect in the first conversation with Dupont paid no mind finding in them the pretext for hilarity. The fact that it is, as Dupont insinuates, because a problem is too simple, indeed too self-evident that it may appear obscure, will never have any more impact on him than a somewhat vigorous rub of the ribcage. Everything is done to make us believe he is an imbecile. This is powerfully articulated in the claim that he and his henchmen will never conceive of anything beyond what an ordinary rascal might imagine for hiding an object. This is because the all too well-known series of extraordinary hiding places, running the gamut from desk drawers to removable tabletops, from the unstitching upholstery of chairs to the hollowing out legs, and from the back sides of the quicksilvering of mirrors to the thickness of book bindings. So they're just going through everything and not realizing that the letter, well, where's the letter going to be? Like, they think because, like, oh, he's so sneaky that it must be somewhere hidden because it is of great prestige and importance because it deals with the queen. But it's like, no. The funny thing is like, where do letters go? Usually in a letter holder or like on the table or something like that, like where they're designated. And so they're just like anticipating something, hidden. And it's like, I think I said this in the first video that like these other psychoanalysts prior to Lacan are just saying like, you got to look really hard, and it's when they wouldn't use the term. Most of them wouldn't use death drive, especially if they're like Freudian revisionists or they're like object relationists or even like ego psychologists. They're more focused on like listening to these thematic scenes of the subject's past, thinking that they're going to find the truth in even these acting outs, even these like so far as like slandering the analyst and all these melodramatic scenes. But no, most of the time the signifier comes out when you least expect it, which is going to be right in front of us. And that's the same thing with the letter. The letter, where's the letter supposed to be? Like I said right there. Well, where is the symptom supposed to be when it repeats? In speech, in the language. When it reveals itself is when it's least expected, because sometimes it comes out in the most obvious and mundane things, especially like a parapraxis. We do that every day, and we won't pay any mind to it. And it's even funny how we'll even disavow it, like, oh, I had a Freudian slip. Oh, I wonder what that means. But it's like, no, that's not the point. But the point is that when it repeats and it's so like repetitive, that it's so like mundane, almost like, we pay mind to a first sneeze, right? And maybe even a second one. But then after a third sneeze, we start to get like, okay, that's enough, right? After that, we pay no mind to it, or we want to forget it. But it's like, no, it's not even that it gets better after that. It's the fact it's the more obvious the thing is, the more that it gets overlooked or it gets shunned, or we pay no mind to it. But again, Lacan is like, look at how savvy Poe is, right, at displaying this sort of theme for us, and how we could see the same thing happen with analysis. All right. Bars. This man's spitting right here. Everything is done to make us believe he is an imbecile. This is powerfully articulated in the claim that he and his henchmen will never conceive of anything beyond the ordinary rascal might imagine for hiding an object. That is precisely all too well known in the series' extraordinary hiding places, running the gamut of hidden desk drawers to remove tabletops. And now I know I already read that, but I'm going to read it again. From the unstitching upholstery of chairs to the hollowed-out legs, and from the back side of the quicksilver of the mirror to the thickness of book bindings. This gives way to making fun of the perfect error when he deduces that because the minister is a poet, he is only one removed from a fool, an error, it is argued, that simply consists, although this is hardly negligible, in a non-distributable, it's Latin, non-distributio medi, since it is far from following from the fact that all fools are poets. Yes, indeed. But we ourselves are left at error regarding what constitutes the poet's superiority in the art of concealment. Even he turns out to be a mathematician to boot, since we suddenly lose whatever momentum we had when we are dragged into a thicket of unprovoked arguments directed against the reasoning of mathematicians, who have never, to my knowledge, shown much devotion to their formulas as to identify them with reason. At least let me bear witness to the fact that, unlike what seems to be Poe's experience, I occasionally hazard such serious mischief, virtual blasphemy according to Poe, before my friend Rigouet, whose presence here guarantees you to my incursions into a combinatory analysis do not lead us astray as to question whether perhaps, all right, now he's reading off an equation right here, so x squared plus px is not altogether equal to q. Without ever, here I refute Poe, having to fend off my unexpected attack. Isn't so much intelligent being expended then simply to divert our attention from what had been indicated earlier as given, namely that the police have looked everywhere? We were to understand this regarding the field in which the police, not without reason, assumed the letter must be found in the sense of an exhaustion of space, but which is no doubt theoretical, which we are expected to take literally if the story is to have its piquancy. The division of the entire surface into numbered compartments, which was the principle governing the operation, is presented to us as so accurate that the 15th part of a line it is said could not escape the probing of the investigators. Are we not then within our right to ask how it happened that the letter was not found anywhere, or rather to observe that nothing we are told about a higher caliber conception of concealment ultimately explains how the letter managed to escape detection, since the field exhaustively combed did in fact contain it. So exhaustively combed did in fact contain it, as Dupin's discovery eventually proved. Must the letter then of all objects have been endowed with the property of nullity, to use a term which the well-known Roget's Thesaurus picks up from the semiological utopia of Bishop Wilkins? It is evident, a little too self-evident, that the letter has in effect relations with location, for which no French word has the entire import of the English adjective odd. Bizarre, by which Baudelaire regularly translates into French, is only approximate. Let us say that these relations are singulars, for they are the very same ones that the signifier maintains with the location. You realize that my intention is not to turn them into subtle relations, that my aim is not to confuse letter with spirit. Even when we receive this former by the pneumatic dispatch, and that I readily admit that one skill is the other gives life insofar as the signifier, you are perhaps beginning to catch my drift, materializes the instance of death. But whereas it is first of all the materiality of the signifier that I have to emphasize. The materiality is singular in many ways. The first of which is not to allow of partition, cut a letter into small pieces and it remains the letter that it is. And this is, in a completely different sense, the Gestalt theories can account for with the latent vitalism in its notion of the whole. So he's pretty much like comparing it, like, to divide the signifier or divide the letter, you're still going to get, a signifier that no matter what, even in the sense of redoubling, we have the signifier still that, in a sense, well, not even just the signifier, but the subject. The subject divided, like Zizek uses this. He uses this in one of his lectures. I want to say it was the Four Discourses. I could be wrong, but that the subject, if you keep dividing it, and he compares it to like some analytic philosopher, I forget who it was, that you can only go so far until you get like a less than nothing that can't be divided any longer, but it still represents something, a subject. Just like, well, with the image, an image is a totality, especially for a Gestalt theory, and that even to produce an image, you still get an image. So, in a sense, I think he's trying to get at something similar to that by comparison. Language hands down its sentences to those who know how to hear it. Through the use of the article employed as the partitive particle, indeed, it is here that spirit, if spirit be living signification, seems no less singularly to allow for the quantification more than the letter does. To begin with, through the very signification that allows us to say the discourse is full of meaning, just as it allows us to recognize some intentionality in the act to deplore that there is no longer any love to store up hatred and expand devotion, and to note that so much infatuation can be reconciled with the fact that there will always be plenty of ass to go around and brawling among men. Lacan. But as for the letter itself, whether we take in the sense of a topographical element of an epistle or of what constitutes a man of letters, we commonly say that what people say must be understood as a la lettre, to the letter, or literally, that a letter is being held for you at the post office, or even to say that you are well versed in letters, never that there is some amount of letter anywhere, whatever the context, even to designate late mail. For the signifier is a unique unit of being which by its very nature is the symbol of but an absence. This is why we cannot say of the purloined letter that, like other objects, it must be or not be somewhere, but rather that, unlike them, it will be and will not be where it is wherever it goes. And so this kind of reminds me of the saying, I don't know in German, but it's like, where it was, ego will be. So like, it being the subject, and the subject is always in relation to the letter, even to speak about it. So like, my speculation is like, even to speak about the subject is already to signify it. And you get the S1, and then to signify that relation, you get the S2, the battery and the knowledge, and so on and so forth. But what we're getting at is ultimately we're talking about the signifier, the letter itself, which is both somewhere and nowhere. It locates itself in the discourse, but it's not strictly within the discourse, which I want to say is like what French structuralism was about. But Lacan is neither a pure structuralist, nor can we call him a post-structuralist, right? It's like he cannot even be located in that. He's just like the subject. In a sense, he's talking about a decentered subject, but one that can't be reduced down or just leveled on pure historical relativity and cultural symbolic discourse. It's rather something that escapes structure and escapes particularity, right? And it is that thing that's still a letter, even if you cut it down, even if you reduce it down. But again, it's like it's in the absence, and the signifier is revealed also by its absence. One of the things that he talks about in the first seminar is I want to say it's J.L. Austin, I think is the name, an analytic philosopher of language, how to use words and how you could signify something without actually having to say it. Now, for instance, when you say "I do" at a wedding, you're signifying something with that something being absence, like all the things that come from that, the loyalty, the fidelity, being there for your partner in a time of, sorrow and suffering and pain, and even the good days, and even all the fights that come with that. It's that is absent, but what is present is the "I do." Or, and again, shout out to Brian Becker, who talks about this too and points this out in his Seminar 1 series. The father or somebody, like at a dinner table, they're looking for the salt, and it's all the way on the other side, and they go, "Oh, there's the salt," right? We got words, but there's a performativity in which the signification is absent, right? It's not present in the signifiers being used in speech, but yet it's still indicative of the fact of like, hey, I want the salt to be passed to me. When I look and it's not near my vicinity, and then I look over and it's like, oh, there's the salt, and I'm gesturing for them to bring it to me. So, we could think of it like that, right? So, where was I? All right. But as for the letter itself, I already read that. For the signifier is a unique being. I will read this again because this is important. For the signifier is a unique unit of being, which by its very nature is a symbol but of absence. This is why we cannot say of the purloined letter that, like other objects, it must be or not be somewhere, but rather that, unlike them, it will be and it will not be where it is wherever it goes. That's a mouthful. Let us, in fact, look more closely at what happens to the police. We are spared none of the details concerning the procedure used in searching the space subjected to the investigation. From the division of the space into the volumes from which the slightest bulk cannot escape detection, to needles probing soft cushions, and given that they cannot simply sound the hard wood for cavities, to an examination with the microscope to detect gimlet dust from any holes drilled in it, and even the slightest gaping in the joints of furniture. They're just everywhere. They're just like up in there. They're just like really getting down to the nitty-gritty details, and yet they, are so lost in the intricacies of their job and literally trying to find it because they think that this poet is like so crafty at hiding something. But no, in fact, in his hiding, he makes it so obvious that it becomes hidden to the people, right? And it all comes down to what I was talking about earlier about the way the odd and evens games are played, or the gambling, so focused on the individuals that you forget, the sort of scansion of the game, right? So it's funny. It's an imaginary relationship that conceals and misrecognizes how language or like the symbolic order functions, because the police, their job is to search, right? And so their grandiose imagination of the minister put into not only a culprit but also like a thief who's hiding something of important. Well, he must think like a thief, but no, it's because they're so caught up in this imaginary relationship that they let the letter slip away, right? And it makes me think it's like sometimes this could be, as far as on the level of analysis, like trying to overly get too excited, and you may just try to look for like a sort of Oedipal relationship to where it doesn't belong, and put somebody in a mommy, daddy, me thing that realize no, the signifier is not in there. The signifier is where you least expected it. It's because they're talking much about the family. It's like you're thinking like a cop, and you're not thinking like an analyst, or thinking like more of a detective like Dupin rather than a cop trying to look for stuff. So. So, as their networks tighten up to the point that, not satisfied with the shaking of the pages of the books, the police take to counting them. Don't we see space itself shed its leaves like a letter? But the seekers have such an immutable notion of reality that they fail to notice that their search tends to transform it into its object, a trait by which they might be able to distinguish the object from all others. This would no doubt be too much to ask them, not because of their lack of insight, but rather because of ours. For their imbecility is of neither the individual nor the corporate variety. Its source is the subjective. It is the imbecility of the realist who does not pause to observe that nothing, however deep into the bowels of the world a hand may shove it, will even be hidden there, since another hand can retrieve it, and that what is hidden is never but what is not in its place. Manque à sa place, as a call slip says of a volume mislaid in a library. And even if the book were on the adjacent shelf or in the next slot, it would be hidden there, however visible it may seem there. For it can literally be said that something is not in its place only of what can change places, that is, of the symbolic. For the real, whatever upheaval we subject it to is always, in every case, in its place. It carries its place stuck to the sole of its shoe, there being nothing that can exile it from it. Now, to return to our policemen, how could they have grasped the letter when they took it from the place where it was hidden? What were they turning over with their fingers but something that did not fit the description that had been given of it? A letter, a litter. In Joyce's circle, they played on the homophony of the two words in English. The seeming scrap of waste paper the police were handling at that moment did not reveal its other nature by it being only half torn into two. A different cipher on a seal of another color and a distinctive mark of a different handwriting in superscription served as the most inviolable of hiding places here. And if they stopped at the reverse side of the letter, on which, as we know, the recipient's address was written at the same time, it was because the letter had for them no other side but this reverse side. What might they have detected on the basis of its obverse? Its message, as it is often said, an answering, pleasing to our amateur cybernetic streak. But does it not occur to us that this message had already reached its addressee and has even been left behind along with the insignificant scrap of paper, which now represents it no less well than the original note? If we could say that the letter has fulfilled its destiny after having served its function, the ceremony of returning letters would be a less commonly accepted way to bring to a close the extinguishing of the fires of Cupid's festivities. The signifier is not functional, and the mobilization of the elegant society whose frolics we are following would have no meaning if the letter limited itself to having but one. Announcing that meaning to a squad of cops would hardly be an adequate means of keeping it secret. We could even admit that the letter has an entirely different, if not a more consuming meaning to the Queen than the one it offers up to the minister's ken. The sequence of events would not be appreciably affected, not even if the letter were strictly incomprehensible to a reader not in the know. For the letter is certainly not incomprehensible to everybody, since, as the Perfect emphatically assures us, eliciting everyone's mockery, the disclosure of the document to a third person, who shall be nameless, his name leaping to mind like a pig's tail twixt the teeth of Father Ubu, would bring into question the honor of a personage of the most exalted station. Indeed, the illustrious personage have a very honor and peace would be so jeopardized. Hence, it would be dangerous to let circulate not only the meaning but also the text of the message, and it would be all the more dangerous the more harmless it might appear to be, since the risks of an unwitting indiscretion by one of the letter's trustees would thus be increased. Nothing then can save the police's position, and nothing would be changed by making them more cultured. Scripta manet. In vain would they learn from a deluxe edition humanism the proverbial lesson which the words verba volant conclude. Would that it were the case the writing remain as it is true, rather of spoken words, for the indelible debt of those words at least enrich our acts with its transfers. Writings scattered to the four winds the blank checks of a mad charge of the cavalry. And were there no loose sheets, there would be no purloined letters. But what of it? For there to be purloined letters, we wonder to whom does a letter belong? I stressed a moment ago the oddity implicit in returning a letter to a person who had formerly let ardently fly its pledge. And we generally deem unworthy the method of such premature publications as the one by which the Knight of Eon put several of his correspondents in a rather pitiful position. Might a letter to which the sender retains certain rights then not belong altogether to the person to whom it is addressed? Might it be that the letter or the latter was never the true addressee? What will enlighten us is what may at first obscure the matter, namely the fact that the story tells us virtually nothing about the sender or about the contents of the letter. We are merely informed that the minister immediately recognized the hand that wrote the Queen's address on it, and it is only incidentally mentioned in a discussion of the camouflaging of a letter by the minister that the original cipher is that of the Duke of S. A's for the letter's import. We know only the dangers it would bring were it to fall into the hands of a certain third party, and that its possession has allowed the minister to wield for political purposes to a very dangerous extent the power it assured him over the persons concerned. But this tells us nothing about the message it carries. So it's like we don't know the contents of the letter. And I did say at first, like, it was probably like, I think the queen, the king to the queen, but no. And so we don't know it at all. But he forges something on there and replaces it with a fraudulent letter, right? And so even though he recognizes it, he writes something else on it. So it's like where it falls into the wrong hands, whatever the case it may be, it's that perfect opportunity to create a misrecognition that no matter what would still jeopardize, it would still jeopardize whoever wrote it for the queen and the queen themselves, just on this insistence and the fact that regardless of what the contents are, it's arbitrary, right? But yet in the fact that this minister was able to snatch it and then write the original cipher, as he says right here, camouflaging of the letter by the minister, that the original cipher is that of the Duke of S and A's for the letter's import. So I guess what it's saying is that by doing this, like, it makes it more dangerous to get into the wrong hands, to jeopardize, right? And well, ultimately, no matter what, this letter is going to return to its place. But it's also putting into question, was it meant for the queen to begin with? Is it really purloined? Like, what is being... Because purloined is like to steal something. So it's like, it's very interesting to kind of think about what's going on here, in this entire scenario, right? Anyway, let's keep reading. Love letter or conspiratorial letter Informant's letters or directive demanding letter of distress, we can rest assured about one thing: the queen cannot let her lord and master know about it. Now, these terms, far from allowing for the disparaging tone they have in the bourgeois comedy, take on an eminent meaning, since they designate her sovereign, to whom she is bound by pledge of loyalty, and doubly so, since her role as a spouse does not relieve her of her duties as a subject, but rather elevates her to the role of a guardian of the power that royalty by law incarnates, which is called legitimacy. And so, yeah, like, whatever the case is, like, she can't let him know. And, you know, not even that she is put in a role of legitimacy, but, like, what if the fact that this letter gains more legitimacy from the fact that it is, like, taken by the minister and then, you know, used for whatever purpose, regardless of the contents of it, right? Thus, whatever action the queen has decided to take regarding the letter, the fact remains that this letter is a symbol of a pact, and that even if its addressee does not assume responsibility for this pact, the existence of the letter situates her in the symbolic chain foreign to the one constitutes her loyalty. Its incompatibility with her loyalty is proven by the fact that possession of the letter is impossible to bring forward publicity as legitimate, and that in order to have this possession respected, the queen can only invoke her right to privacy, whose privilege is based on the very honor that this process violates. For she who incarnates the graceful figure of the sovereignty cannot welcome even a private communication without the power being concerned. And she cannot lay claim to secrecy in relation to the sovereign without her actions becoming clandestine. Hence, the responsibility of the letter's author takes a backseat to that of its holder. So pretty much the responsibility is from the holder and not the author. For the offense to the majesty is compounded by high treason. I say the holder and not the owner, for it becomes clear thus that the addressee's ownership of the letter is no less questionable than that of anyone else whose hands it may fall on, since nothing concerning the existence of the letter can fall back into place without the person whose prerogatives it infringes on having pronounced judgment on it. So there's really no owner of the letter, only fact that there is just a holder of it. So who even knows if, let's even say that it doesn't even belong to the queen, but the fact that the queen was just the holder of it. But maybe even that could be irrelevant. Maybe the fact that of the matter is that when we look at the signifier, it's not like that there is an ownership of the signifier, but that the signifier always moves in different placeholders, right? And thus, we should start thinking about the metaphorization of the subject, the signifier, and that the signifier represents a subject for another signifier. And that we always got this repetition of the sign going through different placeholders, right? Different metaphorizations. I wouldn't say ownerships, and it doesn't even belong, but that there's different substitutions. And this is like on an abstract level. I know in the beginning he talks about how the signifier chain work, or not signifier chain, but the different clinical structures. But I'm wondering how it would work in the level of the psychotic. Well, psychotic wouldn't even have an S1 because it's foreclosed. It wouldn't have the master signifier. So maybe that could be out of the question. But it makes me think about if this is what it's happening on the level of the neurotic structure and substitution, and that it's not about the contents, but about the signifier moving in different placeholders through speech, right? So, however, none of this implies that even the letter's secrecy is indefensible. It would in any way be honorable to denounce that secret. Honesty homines. The decent people cannot get off this hook so easily, not even the honorable men. There is more than one religio. Sacred ties shall not cease to pull us into opposite directions anytime soon. As for ambitus. A detour, as we see, is not always inspired by the ambition. For although I am taking a detour here, I have not stolen. But as he used the term voler, I think that is like a play on words. I remember we talked about it in the Seminar 2 one, which you should check out. It's definitely really good with Vanishing Mediators, Nick and I. Drop it below. So stolen, voler, that's the word for it. Since, to be quite frank, I have adopted the title of Baudelaire's I have adopted the title Baudelaire gave the story only in order to stress not the signifier's conventional nature, as it is correctly put, but rather its priority over the signified. Despite his devotion, Baudelaire nevertheless betrayed Poe by translating his title, the Purloined Letter, as lettre volée, the stolen letter. The English title contains a word rare enough for us to find it easier to define its etymology rather than its usage. The purloin, says the Oxford English Dictionary, is an Anglo-French word that it is composed of the prefix per, found in purpose, purchase, and purport, and the Old French word long, longueur, longuer, which recognizes in the first element the Latin pro as opposed to ante, insofar as it presupposes a back and forth of which it stands, possibly to guarantee it, or even to stand in as its guarantor. Whereas the ante goes forth to meet where it comes to meet it. As for the second, the Old French word longueur is a verb that attributes place on loin or longue, which does not mean à loin far off, but à longue de alongside. To purloin is thus mettre de côté. Now, my Latin, my French, whatever is terrible, so, don't mind me. Right? So, to purloin is thus mettre de côté, to set aside, or to resort to a colloquialism which plays off of the two meanings, mettre à gauche, to put to the left side, literally, and to tuck away. Our detour is thus validated by the very object which leads us into it. So it's not that it's stolen, it's that it's left aside and tucked away, right? We would think it was stolen, but no, it was just left aside and tucked away, just like the signifier, right, in the unconscious. We are quite simply dealing with a letter which has been detoured and tucked away, right? It's just, it goes astray, but only to come back and return to its place. One whose trajectory has been prolonged. This is literally the English word in the title. Or to resort to the language of the post office, a letter en souffrance, awaiting delivery or unclaimed. Here then, the letter's singularity reduced to its simplest expression is simple and odd. And we shall stop there, just like a variable length session. Let us think about that. Let us think about how the letter, the signifier, is prolonged, tucked away, detoured. But the letter, not having any ownership, not even being claimed, just being tucked away, being detoured in different placeholders, only to arrive at its destination. That will be it for now. We will return to the third part and continue. So I hope you all enjoyed that. Again, like, subscribe, leave a comment below if you have any questions. If there's something that I missed, something that didn't make sense, or something that needs to be corrected. All right? So have a good night, y'all. Big Sig is out.